Over 2,500 documented cases of children claiming to remember previous lives are currently archived at the University of Virginia, presenting a data set that challenges the conventional boundaries of neuroscience and psychiatry. These accounts often involve toddlers who provide specific names, locations, and details of a life that ended before they were born, sometimes in places they've never visited. It's a phenomenon that forces us to look at the intersection of memory, biology, and the possibility of some form of consciousness survival.
The scale of that database is quite significant because it isn't just a collection of ghost stories or local folklore. This systematic research was pioneered by Dr. Ian Stevenson, who was the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia back in the late 1950s. He shifted his focus from traditional psychosomatic medicine to investigating these cases of the reincarnation type after realizing how frequently they were being reported across different cultures. He wasn't looking for proof in a theological sense, but was applying a rigorous forensic methodology to see if there were alternative explanations for how these children could know what they knew.
When we talk about rigorous methodology in this context, it feels like an uphill battle. How do you objectively verify the claims of a 4-year-old? Skeptics would argue that children are incredibly impressionable, and it's easy for parents to feed them information or for the child to pick up details from their environment without realizing it.
That's exactly the concern Stevenson tried to address by prioritizing what he called solved cases. A case is considered solved when the child's descriptions lead researchers to a specific, real-world person who actually existed and died. Stevenson and his successor, Dr. Jim Tucker, would travel to the locations, often in remote villages, to interview the child's parents, and then separately the family of the deceased person. They looked for what they called early bird items, statements the child made before the two families ever had contact. The goal was to rule out information leakage, where the child might have heard adults talking or seen a news report.
There's a famous historical case from India that often comes up in these discussions, involving a young girl named Shanti Devi in the 1930s. Her story was so compelling that it even caught the attention of Mahatma Gandhi, who ended up appointing a formal committee to investigate her claims.
Shanti Devi is arguably the foundational case for modern reincarnation research. Born in Delhi in 1926, she began claiming at age 4 that her real home was in a town called Mathura, about 75 miles away. She insisted her name was Lugdi and that she had died shortly after giving birth to a son. What made her case stand out wasn't just the claim itself, but the specificity. She described her husband, a merchant named Kaun Hoon, mentioned he wore reading glasses and had a distinctive wart on his left cheek, and even detailed the specific surgical procedures she underwent during her fatal labor.
And the verification of those details was quite dramatic, wasn't it? It wasn't just a matter of matching a name in a directory.
It was far more personal than that. A letter was sent to Kaun Hoon in Mathura, and he confirmed that his wife, Lugdi Devi, had indeed died in 1925, just over a year before Shanti was born. Kaun Hoon actually traveled to Delhi to meet Shanti, but he did so under a false name, pretending to be his own brother to see if she would recognize him. She identified him immediately. Later, when the committee took her to Mathura, she led them from the train station to her former home without any guidance. She even pointed out a spot where she claimed to have buried 150 rupees in a hole under the floorboards of an upstairs room. They found the hidden space, and though it was empty, Kaun Hoon eventually admitted he had removed the money after his wife's death.
Even with those details, a critic might point to the cultural context. India has a deeply rooted belief in reincarnation, which might make families more likely to interpret a child's imagination through that lens. But these cases aren't limited to reincarnation-friendly cultures. There's a modern American case that's received a lot of scrutiny, the story of James Leininger.
The James Leininger case is fascinating because his parents were devout Christians who had no initial belief in reincarnation. Around age 2, James began having violent nightmares of a plane crash. He would scream, "Airplane crash, plane on fire, little man can't get out." As he got older, he started providing technical details that were highly unusual for a toddler. He talked about flying a Corsair, mentioned the plane taking off from a ship called the Natoma, and gave the name of a co-pilot, Jack Larson.
But isn't it possible he saw a documentary or played with a specific toy that gave him those names? Most kids go through a phase where they're obsessed with planes or trains.
That's the standard skeptical rebuttal, and researchers like Michael Sudduth have argued that James might have been exposed to aviation museums or specific films that his parents didn't fully account for. However, Jim Tucker's investigation highlighted that some of the documentation of James's claims occurred before his father, Bruce Leininger, had identified the pilot. For instance, the name Natoma was recorded early on. Bruce eventually discovered there was a small escort carrier called the USS Natoma Bay, and that a pilot named James Houston Jr. had been shot down over the Pacific in 1945. The details matched. Houston flew a Corsair, he was shot down during the Iwo Jima operation, and his fellow pilot was indeed a man named Jack Larson.
The push and pull between the suggestive evidence and the skeptical explanations often comes down to the timing of when a memory is recorded. If a parent only writes down what the child said after they've done their own research, the evidence is almost worthless because of confirmation bias.
Precisely. This is why the University of Virginia team looks for Type B cases, where there's a written record of the child's statements before the previous personality is identified. They've found that in many of these cases, the child's statements are just as accurate as in cases where the families already knew each other. But beyond verbal memories, Stevenson also documented something much more difficult to explain through social influence: birthmarks and birth defects.
This is probably the most controversial part of his work. He published a massive 2-volume study called Reincarnation and Biology, where he claimed that some children are born with marks that correspond to the fatal wounds of the person they remember.
It's a huge work, over 2,000 pages. He documented more than 200 cases where a child had a birthmark or a congenital defect that matched a wound on the deceased person. In one case in Thailand, a child remembered a man who had been shot in the back of the head. The child had 2 birthmarks, a small, round one on the back of his head and a larger, irregular one on his forehead. When Stevenson obtained the autopsy report for the deceased man, it showed an entry wound in the back of the head and an exit wound in the front, precisely where the child's birthmarks were located. From a biological standpoint, we don't really have a mechanism to explain how a traumatic injury in one individual could influence the skin pigmentation or physical development of a completely different fetus months or years later.
If we set aside the metaphysical for a moment, what are the psychological patterns here? You mentioned these memories usually start around age 2 or 3. Do they persist into adulthood?
In the vast majority of cases, about 75%, the memories fade by age 6 or 7. This coincides with when children start school and their brains begin a period of synaptic pruning, where they lose a lot of their early childhood memories. Interestingly, the children often exhibit behaviors that match the previous person's life, too. If they remember being someone of the opposite gender, they might insist on dressing in that gender's clothing. If they remember a violent death, they often have intense phobias. In the sample of children who remembered drowning, many were terrified of being immersed in water, even if they'd never had a bad experience with it in their current life.
What about the intermission? Do these children ever talk about what happened between the death and the new birth?
About 20% of the children in the University of Virginia database report what are called intermission memories. They describe being in a state of suspended awareness, watching their own funerals, or even choosing their new parents. This is where we see a lot of cultural variation. Children in Western countries often describe a more heavenly or otherworldly environment, while children in places like Burma or Thailand often describe staying near their previous home or a local temple. It suggests that if these experiences are real, the way the mind interprets them is heavily influenced by the cultural scripts available to the child.
That cultural influence is a double-edged sword for the research. On one hand, it's easier to find these cases in cultures that expect them. On the other, that expectation makes it harder to prove the child isn't just performing a role they've seen others play.
That is the central tension, but Jim Tucker points out that the phenomenon occurs even in families that are actively hostile to the idea. There are cases in the US and Europe where parents have tried to suppress the child's talk, fearing they were mentally ill or possessed. Despite that suppression, the children continue to insist on their other identity until the memories naturally fade. There's also the phenomenon of xenoglossy, where a person suddenly speaks a language they've never learned. Stevenson investigated several cases of this, though they're extremely rare and often criticized by linguists for being recitative, meaning the person is just repeating phrases, rather than responsive, where they can actually hold a conversation.
It feels like we're left with a body of evidence that is, as Stevenson put it, suggestive rather than definitive. You have thousands of anecdotes, some with incredible physical correlates like birthmarks, and a dataset that shows consistent patterns across time and geography. Yet, because there's no known physical mechanism for the transfer of memory without a brain, it remains on the fringe of science.
It forces a choice between two uncomfortable possibilities. Either there's a massive cross-cultural psychological phenomenon involving the spontaneous construction of false memories in children that we don't fully understand, or our current model of consciousness, that it's strictly a product of the physical brain, is incomplete. Researchers at the Division of Perceptual Studies argue that we should treat these cases as data points that might eventually lead to a more non-local theory of mind, where consciousness isn't something the brain produces, but something the brain receives or filters.
Whether these stories are glimpses into a previous life or a strange quirk of human development, they certainly suggest that the early childhood mind is capable of far more complexity than we often give it credit for. If you found this exploration of memory and identity intriguing, consider sharing this discussion with someone who enjoys looking at the mysteries of the mind.